hit record. So that's now recording. So let's get started. Our first speaker this evening is Professor Liz Halcomb, who will be presenting on peer reviewing. Liz is the inaugural Professor of Primary Healthcare Nursing at the University of Wollongong in New South Wales, Australia, where she leads a research program in primary care nursing. Liz is an editor of Collegian, which is the official journal of the Australian College of Nursing, and the chief editor of Nurse Researcher, which is a journal of the Royal College of Nursing in the UK. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much, Jess. I'm really pleased to be here presenting today, and I wanted to talk to people about what it is to be a peer reviewer and who can do the peer review process. So one of the things that a lot of ECRs and PhD students say to me is, I don't have enough experience to peer review. I'm not important enough yet. I don't have my PhD. I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to be a peer reviewer. But the reality is, anyone who has similar competencies to the author, or anyone who understands the field about which a paper is written, can actually be a peer reviewer. So depending on what journal you're peer reviewing for, or what the paper's about, depends on what the qualifications are needed of someone. And I guess the NHMRC in Australia say that every researcher has a responsibility to be a peer reviewer. Next slide, please. So how to become a peer reviewer? I think this is probably a bit of a interesting question nowadays. And I think how do you not be a peer reviewer is probably the most interesting question. Certainly my inbox gets filled with spam of all sorts of interesting reviewer invitations from every day, from astrophysics through to chemical science and other dodgy overseas journals. But the reality is that journals tend to select their reviewers from either a publisher's database or online tools of people who've published in a particular area. So if you've got an interest in a particular area, or there's a particular journal that fits closely with your expertise, certainly putting your hand up and submitting a nomination or an application to review is normally reasonable, and they would have a reviewer database. One of the important things to think, though, about when you do a reviewer profile is don't put that you're an expert in everything, because clearly most of us are not. Most of us have a particular area of research expertise and a particular topic area of expertise. And it's amazing how many reviewer profiles you see as an editor where someone's got a list of about 20 things that they're an expert in. And I guess that means that you're going to end up with a whole lot of papers that are not in your area of expertise. So think carefully about what it is you actually are good at and where your area of expertise is, to make sure that your reviewer profile helps the editor to select the right person. And finally, I guess it's about checking those reviewer invitations and making sure that if you are invited to review for a journal, that it is actually a robust journal and it's not some predatory or fake journal that's trying to scam you. A couple of things about reviewer etiquette. It's really important that people respond to invitations promptly. I think we've all probably been an author on a publication where we've had to wait weeks and weeks and weeks to find out whether our paper's been accepted. And the reason it takes weeks and weeks and weeks is that reviewers can be slow at getting back to us. So if you can respond to invitations promptly and be honest if you can't review a paper, that really helps the editor to find someone else if you're not able to review, or to allocate you the review if you are able to do it. In saying that, sorry, can you just go back for a second? In saying that, please, if you don't feel comfortable reviewing a paper, or a paper you get allocated is not in your area of expertise, it's okay to say no. And it's probably better to say no to a paper than it is to accept a paper to review that's not in your area of expertise. If you say yes to a paper and suddenly you discover that something's happened in your life and you can't review it, it's okay to ask for a short extension. Most editors would prefer to give you an extra couple of days, or perhaps even a week, than to find a new reviewer. So if you are struggling to get it in by the due date, I'd encourage you to contact the editor and have a conversation with them about whether you can have a short extension. And the final really important point there is about, if you do review the first edition of a particular paper and it goes back for review and the authors revise it, it's really good practice to say yes to review the second iteration, because otherwise, if you don't, it has to go to a new reviewer, and that causes all sorts of angst for the authors. So thinking about that when you say yes is really important and helpful to the editor. Next slide, please. A couple of things about thinking about the structure and the way that you develop a review is, obviously every journal is different, and there's nothing more annoying for an author to be told in a review that they've got a section that shouldn't be there, or they haven't added something when it's actually not journal style. So it's really important to be aware of the style of the journal that you're trying to review for. The other thing that some reviewers get really caught up on is the spelling, the typographical errors, and the grammar. And I guess that those things are really important in terms of flagging with the editor that there's a problem with the paper, but certainly they're not things that the reviewer should really be getting hung up on. So make a note of those things, and there's a need to address them, but don't get hung up on those things in your review. Next slide, please. The first thing that I guess people should be looking for in the review is their overall impression. So what is the main question that the paper is addressing, and is it relevant and interesting? Does the paper add to the topic area? Is it well written and clear? Are the conclusions consistent with what's presented? And if the author is disagreeing significantly with what's currently consensus, do they make a substantial case that what they're saying is reasonable? And thinking about those things about the overall impression can help you to formulate your review. Next slide, please. The other thing to look at in a review are the major flaws. So if there's major flaws in a paper, this is what's going to lead a paper to be rejected. So thinking about whether the conclusion is contraindicated or is contradicted by the author's own statistical evidence. So the evidence says one thing and the conclusion says something completely different is obviously a major flaw in a paper. Using a discredited method or incorrect use of a method is clearly inappropriate, or having insufficient or contradictory data or unclear data presentation. Now, it's really important to remember, though, that the author did what they did in their study, and they probably could have done their study 101 different ways, but they didn't. They did it the way they did it. So when you're thinking about flaws, it's important to think about, is the method that the authors have used, is that robust or is it incorrect? It can be incorrect, and that's one thing, but it could just be not the way you would have done it, and that's okay. Next slide, please. It's really important when you do it, when you're a peer reviewer, to have a think about how you structure and how you write a review report. It's important to remember that there's someone on the other end of this report that's going to read your appraisal of their work. And if you write a 10-page critique of how terrible the paper's been without any positive feedback, that can be fairly soul-destroying for an early career researcher. And I guess I'd encourage reviewers to have a think about how they felt when they received reviews and what things made the reviews more helpful to them. So giving some positive feedback and identifying the significance of the work can be really important strategies to encourage the author to continue working. And also identifying any major flaws or weaknesses and being clear about what it is you're asking the person to address. It's not particularly helpful to say that the paper is a bad paper without providing the author with a clear list of strategies of things that you want them to address. Next slide, please. The comments to the editor section is really interesting, and I guess it's important to remember that this piece of the review report is just the communication between the peer reviewer and the editor. And it's really important that this is consistent with what you say to the author. It's not reasonable to say to the author that they've done a really good job and the paper's lovely, and then in this section tell the editor that it's awful and they shouldn't publish it. So although you might want to flag issues in here that you might want clarification on, such as potential plagiarism, or if there's misconduct or particular things you're concerned about, it's really about flagging those issues, but being consistent with what you've said to the authors in the other sections. In terms of recommendations, if you suggest any changes, then the paper clearly shouldn't be accepted. It needs to go back and be revised. If you are recommending a revision, it's important to be very clear about what must be done to improve the paper to get it accepted. And if you're recommending the paper is rejected, you really need to be clear about why you think the authors can't fix this paper to a standard that would allow it to be published. Next slide, please. A couple of tips for peer review. It's important to show some integrity and keep the concepts and the papers that you reviewed confidential, and identify if you have a particular conflict of interest. Allocating enough time for peer review is important. There's nothing worse than reading a review of your paper where the reviewer clearly hasn't actually read all of the paper and they've just kind of skimmed it over and put something together at the last minute. Someone's spent a lot of time writing this paper, so it's only reasonable that reviewers spend time reviewing it. And understanding the journal requirements to ensure that you understand the particular structure the journal is looking for is really important as well. Next slide, please. A couple of these things we've already talked about, being constructive so that your review is doing something that can try and improve the paper, even if it is rejected. Giving credit where it's due to the authors is really important because they've obviously spent a fair bit of time to pull this paper and submit it together. And accepting that the author did their project and not yours is probably one of the most important things. You may well have approached the problem or the data collection or the analysis in a different way, but it's about understanding whether there's a fatal flaw or whether they just did something different to what you might have done in a similar circumstance. If it's just that they might have done something different, then that's not perhaps unreasonable. However, if it is a fatal flaw or they've used a method incorrectly or synthesized something incorrectly, then that's a different matter. Next slide, please. The next one's one of my favorites, is about avoiding inserting yourself into the piece of work. Again, there's nothing worse than getting a review back with a list of papers that you haven't cited that all seem to come from one author. Oftentimes you have a strong suspicion that that author may well be the reviewer. Particularly in nursing, often do a lot of work around nursing in general practice, and often I get reviews back where there's lots of nurse practitioner literature that's inserted because someone obviously feels that I haven't cited their work quite enough, even though it may well be about acute care. So although it's important to identify if there's literature missing, it's probably not appropriate to necessarily insert your own work. And finally, be kind. Remember that someone is at the other end of this process and you have no idea who that person is. They may well be an esteemed professor with lots of experience, or they may be an early career researcher who's writing their first paper. So being kind is never a bad thing. All of these slides have come from different resources that have been drawn from, particularly from Wiley and Elsevier. So I'd encourage people to have a look at these resources, and there's certainly some more information on the website that people can go to access. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. That was excellent. I can see there is a few comments and questions coming through in the Q&A box. So our presenters can feel free to answer along the way if there's kind of easy questions that you can respond to. Otherwise, we can save them to the Q&A at the end. So next up, I'd like to introduce Professor Tim Stokes, who'll be presenting on the manuscript journey from submission to publication. Tim is a GP and holds the Elaine Gurr Chair of General Practice at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He has over 25 years experience of health services research, spanning general practice, primary healthcare and rural health. He's co-editor-in-chief of New Zealand's Journal of Primary Healthcare. He was previously an associate editor with BMJ Quality and Safety, and he sits on several journal editorial boards. So thank you, Tim. Sorry, Tim, you're just on mute.
Okay, so tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome everyone from Aotearoa. So I'm going to be talking to you, giving you a whistle stop tour. I should stop using tongue twisters in presentations of being a journal editor. And essentially, there's actually 6 steps in the process of thinking about submitting a paper to get it published. So what I really want to do in this presentation is really just talk through about these steps in turn: pre-submission, submission, decision with review, acceptance, proofing the article, and publication. And I put this slide in, not particularly because I want to highlight the fact the Journal of Primary Healthcare currently has quite good metrics. I think the main thing is, as this is something that Liz alluded to, the whole process of peer reviewing journals is under strain because of the volume of reviews that people ask to get to do. The difficulty is often knowing, particularly for early career researchers, is this journal predatory or not? And particularly the fact that the work is often is unpaid, and it therefore can take a long time for the rebus to happen. And Liz gave some very good advice about where we should do that. But if you actually want to find out from journals how long it takes between submitting an article to it being published, it's actually quite difficult to find that information we put this work together on our own journal here, but I'm not looking around at other journals, and what tends to be reported is relatively limited. And I think, and it may actually reflect what the journal wants you to see, not necessarily what's actually happening. Okay, so just to talk this through, journals, I think, should give you some idea of the acceptance rate. They should give you an idea of the time it takes to a first decision without review, which is generally called desk rejection. BMJ Open takes 32 days for that to happen. I would suggest that journals like Annals of Family Medicine, our journal should really take between a week or 2 weeks to do that. Then the article goes out for peer review. And clearly that's going to take some time, because even the best will in the world, even if your reviewers accept fairly promptly, it's going to take, usually at least up to a month for those review comments to come back. But I mean, as you'll see here, we've certainly over the last 6 months had the median time between not only reviews came out, make a decision of around about 34 days. BMJ Open has a turnaround time, 126 days from submission to first decision. Now, I'm not picking on BMJ Open. I'm just using that as an example of a journal I use quite a lot myself, and it is a well-respected open access journal. And I think, as we all know, 3-4 months are 3-4 months are not uncommon for that. The other comment is, which the questions raised, is that it's actually quite difficult to compare the metrics. Journals often, as indeed has been flagged up, combine time to first decision without review and combine time to first decision with review by just saying time to first decision. That's fine, but actually I think you really want to know either. And if you combine them, then you're likely to get a shorter time frame overall. And then, of course, you've then got the time it takes then between a first decision to actual publication. And apart from what BJGP put in about their decision-making frame, median metrics didn't seem to be available. I mean, we're currently running around about 6 to 7 days for my journal at the moment. But I must emphasize, I am not making claims about a journal of primary healthcare. We currently are building up the journal from as co-editors. I think it's more the fact, the emphasis is, there are metrics that should be presented, they're useful to use, and I think I'd encourage journals to be more transparent about that to help us as authors of research ourselves, so that we're clear how long it takes. Because we all know there are journals that may take over a year between submitting a paper to be published, but it'd be good actually to have those metrics available. Okay, next slide. So thinking about pre-submission, it is really important to do your homework. If you have a paper, let's say, for example, it's come from a master's thesis you've been doing, or maybe it's one of your PhD papers, then really work with your colleagues, with your supervisors to work through, actually what journal would be the best fit for my work, okay? And critical to that is making sure that the journal is in scope for the work you've done. And you also ought to consider the reputation of the journal. And I suggest that isn't just metrics or everyone else thinks it's good. It's also what you know about how the papers will be handled. Will it be a relatively slow, impersonal process with multiple requests to do revisions, which is not untypical of large open access journals that charge money? Or was it a journal where the editors actually are personable, they're approachable, they give you advice, and hopefully they will have a reasonably quicker turnaround? And the main thing is to seek advice on that. And then when you do decide to submit, read the journal instructions carefully. We all know there is no standardized format for journal articles, and that causes a huge amount of work. But do prepare the draft in line with the instructions that you get on the website. And I would strongly recommend you do not exceed the word count at submission, because bear in mind, if your paper is revised, often reviewers want more words into the paper. So it's a good idea not to start at or above the word limit. Although most journals will generally be generous, I think, and may accept something up to 10% over, but that is for negotiation. And the main thing as well is, and this has been alluded to by Liz about peer reviewers such times finding it difficult to read poorly written papers, or it detracts from the quality, is do polish your submission as best as you can. Supply everything that's requested, format everything that's requested, write a clear cover letter, double check you know that you're meeting the ethical requirements the journal insists on in terms of how you report, whether you have ethics or not, and if so, what ethics. And many journals will ask you to suggest at least 2 reviewers. And I think, again, I'd recommend that you think carefully about recommending people who aren't conflicted, but also about recommending people who actually might take up the reviewing offer. You suggest their name. Don't just go for a big trophy name, because they're highly likely not to be available to review because they'll be too busy. Okay. Next slide. Now, when you submit to a journal, you will hit an electronic wall, and that will be the journal's electronic management system. Journal of Primary Healthcare is published by Cicero, the Australian publisher, as indeed I think it's the Australian Journal of Primary Health, and essentially uses Clarivate software, Web of Science Group stuff, so the standardized Scholar One login. And that's important because what comes back to you is as much a software system that the editors have to use, just like the reviewers use. So things can appear a bit clunky, but there is a process, and the software, in my view, is efficient. So next slide. So when you submit a paper, and bearing in mind, as I say, if you really have some queries, and you can always approach the journal for advice before submission to ask questions. When your paper is submitted, it often goes to editorial assistant who will check the formatting. Sometimes journals might insist on copyright signatures early, and various things are done. And then the paper will usually go to the editor-in-chief. In our case, there's 2 co-editors-in-chief. And they would then review the paper and I think make a decision if it merits desk rejection. Okay. The usual reason for desk rejection is the paper is out of scope. So we are very clear on our website that the journal is for research in primary healthcare in New Zealand, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. But we get multiple submissions every week from countries outside of those areas, and they will be desk rejected. And then the other thing as well is that the papers may get desk rejected if the editor, and certainly in my case, I would work with my co-editor, if we felt something was in scope, but it really was so poor that we should reject it with critical flaws before peer review, then we would probably cross-check. But it's perfectly reasonable to reject a desk rejection if something clearly will not get through the peer review process. Then most journals will use associate editors. These are often more junior researchers. They may or may not get an honorarium from the journal for doing it, and they will handle the often slow and sometimes thankless task of actually identifying reviewers. Okay, and that can be a slow process. Certainly at Editorial Quality and Safety, I can remember on occasion having to chase up 10 to 15 people to actually get a review, and that's for a good journal. In our case, the volume of submissions we're receiving at the moment is allowing both Felicity and I between us to actually act as the associate editor. And so for the authors, no news at this point is good news, because if you haven't had anything within the first week or 2 of submission, then it doesn't look like your article is going to be desk rejected. And we'll go to the next stage. Thank you. Go to the next slide. So just one aside, one of the things that we do is that we, to pick up on what Liz says, is yes, the software will pop up with a list of people who could review the paper for you, but we'd be very keen to get at least 1 New Zealand reviewer, if not 2 New Zealand reviewers. I'd do a search on PubMed and see if I can actually find out who is currently publishing in this area. And then when I identify people, I will send them a personal email showing that I know who they are, showing that I've at least read one, and I know what they're working on, and invite them in a polite way. And I hope, again, because your letters come from me as editor-in-chief, then they may accept. If they don't accept, then please can they let me have an alternative reviewer that I can approach, and please, as Liz says, can they let me know within a few days of receiving the approach. It doesn't do anyone any good to be waiting for reviewers. So when the reviews come back, the associate editor will review the peer reviews and then make a preliminary recommendation to the editor. And the editor-in-chief essentially makes these range of decisions. It's rare for a peer review journal to be accepted straight off. It's also uncommon for it to be rejected because obviously you've sent it out for peer review, having screened it on the expectation it is likely to pass peer review. Otherwise you would have just rejected it. But the most common things that come back are minor or major revision, and often differences between those are blurred. But what I would say is that minor revision is primarily editorial, or can be fixed relatively straightforward. Major revision may well involve significant restructuring by the authors, say, for example, the method section, and in particular, often the discussion section, because in my experience, discussion sections can be problematic for people to write, and people could do, in my advice would generally be use BMJ structuring for discussion section as a guide. And what the authors need to do is you then need to prepare a cleaned and tracked range of your revised manuscript, and also prepare the rebuttal table. And as Liz says, the expectation I would expect is that the rebuttal table that is sent back to the authors should, from the reviewers, make very clear specific recommendations about what the authors need to change. So not left in any doubt about what they need to do. And the main advice to you is, as authors, is prepare your rebuttal table carefully, address every reviewer's point line by line, where appropriate, put a line number in the text, and then take your time, make sure it's good, and then read submit. Okay, next slide. So before we go on to the next slide, I'm sorry, to go back to the further one before. Yeah, so that's your first revision, okay? It then comes back. If the journal has a policy of sending it out for subsequent revisions until the reviewers say accept, then I fully agree it should be sent to the previous reviewers. But my experience, both with the Journal of Primary Healthcare and also BMJ Quality and Safety, was really recognizing the fact that reviewers are a scarce resource. And I think it is not good to be using reviewers' time just to look at minor editorial revisions. So our policy is that we would screen the papers and only send them back for subsequent peer review to the reviewers if they have asked substantive issues that only they have the ability to address, technical issues, for example, outside their content expertise. And we would handle that next step. So we would come back with, say, reviewer 2 that's from the associate editor and or the executive editor-in-chief, and would be very much around addressing residual concerns that are identified or hadn't been fixed properly from reviewer 1. Revision 1. Is that okay? We can come back to that. Okay. And obviously, what you're hoping for is that at some point you get a nice email that says, "Thank you very much for making your revisions. You fully adjust your viewers' comments. Here's your acceptance email." Sometimes at that point, the editors might just flag a few other things that need to be changed at the proof stage. Although I'd be very keen to make sure that all changes that are needed are identified by the editors at the point of acceptance or have been dealt with before, do some editorial work before acceptance. It then goes off to the copy proof setters. The amount of time that takes varies. In our case, it's probably up to a month before the authors get back the copy. And the main thing is to check your proofs carefully. I've just put an example of a recent paper in BMJ Open, and we had to check the proofs pretty carefully. And a lot of the issues are actually around the fact that the journal used inputted information on the author's job title address, not that was actually on the submitted PDF or Word version of the document. So a lot of cross-checking. So the main thing is there may be some fiddly cross-checking to do. Do check your proofs carefully, because it costs money for the journal to have to reset the proof after publication. And they generally would only correct major errors or omissions if there's a problem. Okay, next slide. So I hope that whistle-stop store of the various steps is useful. You can check out some of what I've said in the BMJ Author Hub guidance. Liz also had some very good guidance she just flagged up. And for reference, the slides I showed you about what a journal software package looks like is on that slide. So thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Tim. That was great. And Tim, there is a question in the Q&A for you about the BMJ article you were referring to, if you wouldn't mind answering that. And there's a few questions that I think Ginny will answer in her presentation coming up. I also just wanted to note, hopefully everyone can see the Q&A and the responses. All our presenters have been very generous in responding to all the questions that you're posting. So please feel free to just post your questions throughout the presentations, as I think that will be the easiest way. It's not this, the webinar is not as interactive as I had hoped. So I think the Q&A approach will be via the tool in Zoom. So please post away. I'd now like to introduce Professor Virginia Lewis, who'll be talking about how to be part of an editorial team or a guest editor for a journal. Ginny holds a research chair in community health in the Australian Institute of Primary Care and Ageing at La Trobe University in Victoria, Australia. She has more than 30 years experience as a health services researcher and evaluator, and has been editor-in-chief of the Australian Journal of Primary Health since 2015. Thank you, Ginny.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'll be quite quick so we can get to the questions then. I think, I think the question that was asked was, and someone's asked it in the chat as well, is about how you actually become an editor and how you become an associate editor of a journal. And the journals obviously differ. So the New Zealand Journal and the Australian Journal, so the journal Tim's speaking about and the journal that I'm editor-in-chief of, are both published by Cyro Publishing, and we both use the Scholar One system, but we are structured differently. So we have associate editors, and I think the point that I think Tim made it, and Liz may have also made it, but things have changed quite a lot in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. It's much more difficult to find reviewers than it used to be. And so when I first started, the Australian Journal of Primary Health only had about 5 associate editors, and we all handled, you know, a reasonable number of papers, and it was all fine. Over time, it's taken a lot more effort to find reviewers. And so most of the associate editors that I have now with the journal are not able to sort of take on the workload that we used to sort of back in the old days. To be an associate editor, so probably the other thing is around the process we use. So with the Australian Journal of Primary Health, the associate editors actually do handle the paper all the way through review to final decision. So they only come back to me as editor-in-chief if they don't feel that it's easy to make the decision. And sometimes it's not. You know, the worst case scenario as an associate editor is when you get a review that says minor changes or accept, and someone who says reject, then your heart falls. You've got to try and find another reviewer, and you probably do want to have a bit of a confab about it. So those ones are really tricky, but for our journal, the associate editor actually does make that decision if they feel that they can on the basis of the reviews that they've received. So to be an associate editor, the main thing that you need is to be willing to spend the time to actually do the job. It used to be the case, I think, that we would ask, we would look for associate editors who were sort of well connected, because you had to find reviewers, and it helped if you kind of knew everybody. These days it doesn't matter as much, because there's so many resources that help you to actually find reviewers. So Tim mentioned that within the for us, the Scholar One system, but whichever the platform that you're using as an associate editor, it generally generates names of people. I often ignore them because they're always the same people. And as Tim said, the high flyers get asked to review so many papers that they'll say no. But there's ways that you can look and find people. So the associate editors we have at the moment are a sort of mix of ECRs and established researchers. And the way that they have come to us has been by recommendation sometimes. Sometimes it's by having been a guest editor of a special issue. Sometimes it's just that someone has contacted me and asked if they've said I'm interested in it, and they've sent me their CV. And they've looked as though they have areas of interest that align with our journal, and they look like that they explain the sort of expertise that they have and what they'd be willing to review. It's important to remember that for us, and again, it's a bit different, I don't review all the papers for sure. I don't have the time to do that. And neither do the associate editors. They don't review the paper themselves. The reviewers are, we are double blind. They go out to review. So the associate editor will read the paper and should be familiar with it, but they don't review them all. So you're not actually reviewing 30 papers a year. You're handling them. We say you're handling those papers. So if you're interested, you can actually contact a journal directly and say, I'm interested in being an associate editor. In particular, I think with the ones who are here today, that's a reasonable thing to do. The other is, if you're an ECR, is to speak to, your colleagues, and particularly your senior research colleagues, and ask them for support to identify a journal that, you might like to approach, and/or an actual introduction. And that certainly is more compelling to me as an editor-in-chief. If someone I know says, I've got a colleague who's an ECR who I think would be a good associate editor, would you like to meet them? So, don't be afraid to kind of put yourself forward and say that you're interested in doing it, but be aware that it is a deal of work. So even if at the moment, as I say, I'm being sort of very gentle with my AEs and trying not to frighten anyone off. So they're not getting very big loads, but it still is difficult. And I think Tim said that he'd had to invite 15 people. We get those papers. Those papers blow your stats out massively. They're big. The other thing the associate editors do for us, they shouldn't get stuff that's out of scope, because that is the editor-in-chief's job. The first job is to say, will I actually send this to an associate editor to go to review? Sometimes I get tired though, and I make bad decisions. So I always encourage our AEs to challenge me if they think I've sent them something really crappy. They also shouldn't be having to handle papers that are very, very badly written, because if I see a paper that's very, very badly written, but which I think underneath all that bad writing might be okay, it will go back to the authors, and I'll ask them to have another stab at it, to perhaps get a professional editor to consider a few things before they then get it back to me. So again, and those sorts of giving people a kind of second chance will also mean that it's a bit slower as a process, but I think it's fair and reasonable. That's probably enough, because I'm conscious of the time, and Rupert hasn't spoken and we won't have time for questions, but yeah, if there is anything, do pop it in the Q&A and I'm happy to type answers. I didn't talk guest editor. So guest editor, again, all journals vary. Our journal does not invite people to submit proposals for special issues. Despite that, I get quite a few of them, and they're usually wildly out of scope. But we will discuss as a panel what kind of issues are coming up, what's topical, and also where there's conferences or the International Year of XYZ, we'll then tie things into that as well. And that can be a good way for someone to sort of get a first taste of working on an editorial panel. But yeah, I'll stop, because otherwise Rupert won't get a shot.
Thanks, Jenny. That was excellent. I'm learning so much this evening, so thank you, everyone. I will now pass over to Rupert. So Professor Rupert Payne is our last presenter this evening. He's a GP and Professor of Primary Care and Clinical Pharmacology at the University of Exeter, UK. His research and educational interests focus on polypharmacy and medication optimization. He has been the consultant editor for the UK journal Prescriber since 2016. So over to you, Rupert. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Good morning and good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. Yeah, we move on to the next slide. I'll just start with a brief disclaimer, if I may. I am not employed by Wiley. I think it's important to say, just because obviously I'm talking about professional journals here, but I do receive an honorarium. I'm not involved in any way in advertising and marketing. So all these are my personal views. I thought I'd start by discussing some of the differences between academic journals that most of us are familiar with publishing in and the clinical or professional journals, which certainly many of the clinicians listening will be familiar with reading, but maybe less familiar with the writing, reviewing or editing for. So firstly, the audience, usually these journals are targeted at clinicians or health managers rather than academics. And the purpose is to cover things like clinical interest, news stories, providing a bit of light relief even. The content's usually directly relevant to current clinical practice or policy rather than covering research. And the writers may be a mixture of clinicians or journalists who may or may not be academics. In terms of peer review, it depends a bit. Some of the opinion pieces, articles, by journalists, for example, might only receive editorial review, but clinical articles will certainly need reviewed for clinical accuracy. And finally, whereas most journal articles will be funded through a combination of advertising, subscription, increasingly, of course, open access charges, advertising may play a bigger role in professional journals, and of course might be the only source of funding for free journals like our own. It's worth remembering, of course, that there's not always a black and white distinction between the two either. Journals like Prescriber and Pulse in the UK have virtually no academic content, whereas many research journals target only an academic audience. But there's lots of journals that do both. So big ones like the BMJ, British Journal of General Practice, are good examples of that. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. Let me say a bit about Prescriber, not as a sales pitch, but rather as a way of trying to illustrate what a typical professional journal might look like. So Prescriber is the leading UK clinical journal focused on prescribing and meds management. It's published monthly for primary care readership. It's mainly GPs and pharmacists, and it's got a print circulation of about 25,000 people. So that's about 40% of UK GPs. We produce next slide, we produce a wide range of articles. I think these are probably fairly typical of the sorts of things other professional journals will publish. So things directly relevant to clinical practice, which sort of form the meat of the journal. And given we're a journal looking at prescribing, it's things like diagnosis and management, reviews of drugs, therapeutic areas, summaries of clinical guidelines, new reviews of products that are just coming to the market. And then we've got what you might think of as current affairs, so reports, analysis, shorter news items. And then there's a range of other items which might be educational, opinion pieces, interesting commentaries. So in the next slide, you know, primary care general practice being what it is, we cover a wide range of subject matters. So I went through the last few months' issues, and there's a few examples here of topics we've covered. So we've had clinical things on everything from contraception, depression, gout, very common things, to more esoteric stuff like pulmonary hypertension and specialist things like monoclonal antibody therapies. We've had journalist reviews of UK conferences, new therapeutic advances, or things like CRISPR for genetic therapies. We do a monthly question around prescribing for sort of testing your sort of knowledge and sort of education thing. And we do opinion pieces and a range of stuff. We've covered historical dimensions of prescribing, innovation in analgesia, and so on. So a mixture of things. Now these articles come from a range of sources. We do get uninvited submissions. They're generally clinically orientated, usually written by clinicians, although occasionally we'll get stuff from academics, medical journalists too. Sometimes it's just an idea that arrives in the mailbox with some bullet points asking if it's something we're interested in. So then it comes down to us to sort of flesh that out and say what we think that the author might want to focus on. A lot of what we publish ends up being commissioned, so ideas generated from suggestions from clinical members of the editorial board in response to news or to fit the recurring feature or theme, following up in a press release. And they're often written by a mixture of clinicians and journalists or medical writers. Certainly professional journals, so next slide, particularly the free ones mainly produced in print form, sort of perfect for reading over coffee, but print journals facing rising costs of production, distribution, falling revenues. Advertisers often prefer digital because it allows them to monitor responses to ads and things. So digital platforms and appropriate content for those platforms are increasingly important. And then the other issue for monthly journals like Prescriber is timeliness. So for example, we really struggled to produce articles on COVID during the pandemic because things happen so quickly, the articles go out of date essentially before you can print them. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what professional and clinical journals are about. But so next slide, what opportunities actually exist for academics to engage with them? So next slide. Well, firstly, there's the writing themselves. So clinical articles usually have a very different style of writing to the approach I think you'll see in academic articles. The writing for professional journal offers an opportunity, though, to develop communication skills when it comes to getting across a message to a key group of people your research is relevant to. So clinicians, potentially people like commissioners or policymakers. Now, these are people who won't read staid academic pieces. So it makes you think about the clinical and policy relevance, that your writing's accessible, concise, you focus on the key messages, don't get distracted by scientific minutiae, and you discuss the outcomes of your research rather than the actual processes required to get there. And then writing for professional journals also acts as a great outlet for issues that are relevant to research, but might lack an obvious home in an academic journal. So we might be talking about new science. Well, that's a possibility of bringing it to a whole new audience you wouldn't usually reach. There's the opportunity to get educated, of course, if you're educating clinicians about your latest bit of research, you can influence practice and policy, and then that's a great route to impact, which is something, of course, that funders and institutions increasingly want us to demonstrate. And then finally, there's a sort of chance for debate and opinion pieces, so raising new ideas, addressing areas of uncertainty and controversy, which can offer an opportunity to get your foot in the door of a new area, which might in turn help people, it might be a springboard essentially to future funding opportunities or more academic pieces. This peer review, as I mentioned before, many journalistic articles, opinion pieces might not be peer reviewed, but it's still got a really important role to play. And this is a great opportunity to hone your skills. Unlike academic articles, though, the principal focus will often be on the clinical aspects rather than the methodology. We want to know the article on clinical practice is accurate, consistent with practice, acknowledges relevant uncertainty, and is generalizable to real world practice. And because of that, a lot of our peer reviewers are clinicians, but it's certainly not essential. Peer review needs a methodical approach. And in my experience, academics often do a much better job of that than the non-academic clinicians. Another thing that's critical is ensuring the article is relevant to practice or generate enough interest and is targeted at the correct readership. And again, I think that's a skill that can benefit your academic work, helping you think about the practical relevance of your research. And finally, there's readability. Obviously, all peer review should look at whether an article is readable, but I think it's particularly important for professional journals where authors are often relatively inexperienced when it comes to writing, and you also face the challenge of making the article accessible, engaging. It's important to get that balance right also in terms of the level of expertise of the audience. And I think, again, all these points are very relevant and translate well to research writing too. And finally, as we've already heard, there's an opportunity to be involved in editorial boards. So editorial boards end up advising on subject matter and potential topics for articles. Can we move on to the next slide, Jess? It can involve giving advice to non-expert writers and content and focus, supporting the peer review process, prioritizing publishing decisions, helping to edit articles for clarity, focus, and so on. And indeed even broader dissemination strategies. And again, many of these skills are again very transferable, but often focus on a more clinical and applied perspective, which I think can help bring a more grounded approach to your own research. Of course, for early mid-career researchers, always looks good in the CV. Sometimes it's a paid role. It's worth saying that editorial boards for these sorts of journals are usually independent of the marketing divisions to avoid conflicts of interest. So the marketing folk will do the work of trying to find relevant advertisers to match articles rather than the other way around. So I'll my final slide, just sum up, I think there's several benefits for academics engaging with professional journals, opportunity to to improve your impact and engagement with your research, improve your writing skills, increase your understanding of what matters to clinicians, develop peer review skills, and gaining editorial and publishing experience. And in terms of, you know, getting involved, just drop the editorial team an email. We're always desperate for articles because it's not the same as people trying to publish stuff. So we often have to rely on people to come to us or search a lot harder to try and commission things than I think academic journals do. So get in touch if you want to write things.
Thank you, Rupert, and thank you to all our wonderful presenters. I also had a question, which I'm just going to ask now. Wasn't able to type it in the chat myself, but just as what the importance of cover letters is. Most journals require you to submit a cover letter with your article, and so I would love to hear from one of our panelists in a minute. If you can briefly share how much detail should be provided, are they read, and so on. And perhaps if any of our panelists want to kind of elaborate on any of their responses to the Q&A, I might just open the floor briefly for just some short discussion. So you're all on mute, but Tim?
Yeah. So I always used to put a lot of effort and pride into my cover letters. And then when I started working for the journal, the volume is you screen them. But I think, like everything, I think you need I think they're important. I think it's the stuff you want to convey, it's important you write them well. They will be read, even if it's to be skimmed. So I think it's important that attention is paid to them.
I think that it can be sometimes it can be and sometimes it doesn't. And as Tim said, you kind of scan them, and there's two types. There's one which just says the standard things that they're required to say, and there's some who say, this is why I think my paper's in scope. Sometimes a paper, in fact, I don't think is in scope the way it's written, but the letter makes me think they probably could manage it if they took it back and had another stab at it. So, you know, in that case, the cover letter can be the difference between getting out to review or not.
Thanks, Tim and Ginny. And there's a few questions in the chat. If I wonder if someone could comment on the different stages, I suppose. So here tonight we've got PhD students, early career researchers, mid-career, and so on. I guess, can you talk a little bit about roles? For example, can a PhD student be a peer reviewer? Can a ECR be an editorial associate editor?
Can I answer that? I mean, I think the answer is most certainly a yes. And it has to be said that my experience, some of the worst reviews I've ever had in terms of quality of reviews has come from senior people who clearly don't spend as much time, where some of the more junior, inexperienced people will spend time. Often there's an opportunity also for more junior people to work with a more senior person to actually review their review to make sure it's adequate and things like that. So it's worthwhile asking your supervisors and stuff like that for a bit of guidance on how to do the review if you've not done it before. And take your time on it. Certainly, you know, as has been said already, I mean, I get hundreds of these requests, and most of the time I have to say no, because I simply would not have a chance to become a full-time job if I accepted all of these requests I get. So only do them if you feel you can put enough time and effort into it. And think, you know, what attention would you like to get from you know, if you were putting in a thing, you know, if you're going to review it, make sure you're going to put the same amount of time in that you would hope to get for one of your own pieces of work. But certainly young, early career researchers can, and PhD students can certainly do this, but ask for help and support if you need it.
I agree with Rupert. I think the other thing I'd like to add is I think it's really good now with an increasing number of journals that send the reviews back to the reviewers, because I think that can be really helpful to see what another reviewer said about the paper. The one thing, though, that I would caution people with that is don't assume that the other reviewer was right and you were wrong, because it wasn't until you sort of became a journal reviewer that you suddenly realised that no two reviewers ever agree on anything anyway. I think it's a very rare day when you get two people who actually recommend the same thing. There's often completely different things that people pick up, but at least by reading the other review you can get a sense of what things you perhaps didn't consider that the other person did consider.
Jess, can I just pick up a question that's come into the chat? So that someone's asked the question or made the comment that they sometimes find it difficult to decide between a reject and a major revision. And I've made the comment, well, you actually don't get to decide as the reviewer anyway, so don't agonize about it. Say I'm finding it hard to recommend one or the other. So you can recommend reject, and as I say, the associate editor or the editor-in-chief, depending on your model, is going to get back these reviews, and they're the one who has to say that person who said reject actually didn't give much reason for it or much foundation, and this person who said accept has given a whole lot of sort of feedback that tells me I can trust their opinion. And so even though I've got those really different responses, I might actually go with the accept or some minor revisions. So, you know, the thing is that the reviewer does not make the decision. The reviewer makes the recommendation. And what we look for in terms of taking that recommendation or thinking about what to do with it is we look for enough information for us to know whether or not their recommendation is based on reasonable opinion and reasonable effort, reasonable assessment. And so that's where if you get a really short review, particularly one that says this isn't very good, that's a disaster because it doesn't give you anything to go on. A really short review that says this is brilliant and wonderful is okay if it really is brilliant and wonderful, but if it's not, then it's also not helpful. And in the system, certainly in the ScholarOne system that Tim and I use, we actually rate all the reviewers. We rate them for how speedy they were and how useful their feedback was. So when someone pops up as a potential reviewer, they come up with a little score. And if someone came up with, a 1 out of 3, you would think, I'm going to perhaps not send the article out to that person to review because there was either something very wrong with their timeliness or something very wrong with their actual feedback.
Thanks, Ginny. I'm just aware of the time, so sadly, I think we'll have to leave this here. Just before we finish, I just wanted to share 2 quick reminders. The first is that you'll be emailed a link for a short evaluation form after the webinar, which we'd be very grateful if you could complete. And secondly, as you'd be aware, this webinar was jointly hosted by AAAPC and SAPSI in the UK. So if you're a primary care researcher and not currently a member of AAAPC, if you're in Australia, New Zealand or SAPSI in the UK, we'd love you to join. The details are on the screen, and more specifically, if you're an ECR or PhD student, we'd love you to join FACES, which is the ECR group of AAAPC. So please contact us if you'd like to join. So thank you to our wonderful presenters. It was really fabulous. I learned so much, and the questions were really excellent. And therefore also thank you to our audience for your lovely feedback that you're sending through and for your really interesting questions. I think it's been a really great hour. So thank you, everyone. Bye all. I'll close the webinar now. I might just send a quick link around to our presenters if you wouldn't mind staying on for another minute. I'll send you an email.